Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the 22nd season of Soul Issue, the African American Perspective. I'm your host, Daryl Newton. On this month's show, we have the opportunity to have a conversation with esteemed writer, author, and educator, William Jelani Cobb. You've read his articles in the New Yorker magazine and seen his countless appearances on network news and TV channels. He recently visited the Great Lakes Bay region, and we had the chance to speak to him, and we'll get his take on key issues that he is very vocal about in the areas of race, politics, history, and culture. It is my great pleasure to speak with esteemed writer, author, and educator, Mr. Jelani Cobb. We talk race, culture, and history, and I get his take on the state of affairs in America and the African American community and how it impacts us all. Let's start with just what brings you to the Great Lakes region today?
So I was invited to participate in the President's Speakers Series at Delta College, and so very happy to be here. And the response to this community, from this community, has been just extremely welcoming, and it's been a great chance to have a conversation here.
We're out of the studio today and we're into the classroom, which is a first for me. So what message do you hope to convey to the students that we have here in the classroom?
I'm a journalism school dean, and so I'm always going to talk about the importance of media and the particulars of the media landscape that we're looking at right now. So that's part of it. It's also important to get an understanding of the connections between past and present. I talk a lot about history and its impact on what's going on in the world around us right now. And so, that's important too. But in the biggest sense of it, I would like for students to take away the importance of their role in upholding and sustaining democracy.
Fantastic. And congrats on your new appointment. I should call you now Dr. Dean Cobb.
Actually, Jelani is fine.
Okay.
You just say Jelani.
Would you like to share just a little bit about what that means to you? I know you've had some affiliation with Columbia, but your rise and your continued successes there, what's your feelings on that?
So I've been a professor at Columbia Journalism School for 6 years, and I was just appointed this past May as the dean of the journalism school. And so I've been in office about 2 months now. And it's really important to me because, one, it's just amazingly humbling to have that opportunity and to have the vote of confidence from my peers and the faculty and the president. And, leadership is a lot of things, but primary among them is that it is an opportunity to make a difference.
Good, great.
And so that's how I'm approaching it.
And I love that, making a difference. You have to start somewhere, someplace. So let's jump right into race. Race has always been an issue in the U.S., and I use a small u right about now because that's kind of how I feel about the united part about it. Has it gotten better or worse? I know that's kind of answers itself, but in your opinion,
both.
How and why?
Yeah, it's always both.
Okay.
There are some parts or some trends and tendencies where we see progress, and some areas where we don't. Sometimes we see things going backward, and it's entirely possible for both of those things to happen at the same time. But the thing that I try to convey is the importance of having a kind of measured optimism, looking at the things that have actually generated sustainable change in our society, in our history, and seeing how we can replicate those things in the present.
Okay, well said, well said. So if race and racism is the elephant in the room, trying to hide, why is it hard for us to have that discussion or that conversation? Who's responsible for solving the problem? Because I've actually had shows addressing this, and Blacks say whites, whites say blacks. What say you?
Yeah, I don't think it's quite that simple. I mean, I think it's a common problem that we inherit, but the weight of it doesn't fall on all of our shoulders equally. The reason why it's so difficult to discuss is that when we talk about the history of discrimination, we talk about the biases and the inequality in our current society. It's easy for people to feel that they're being attacked, for whites to feel that they're being attacked, or that they didn't work hard for the things that they have, and so on. And whenever that conversation comes up, I try to reframe it and say, you likely worked very hard to get where you are. Unfortunately, your hard work and everyone's hard work is not rewarded at the same pace.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're talking about there, kind of distinction.
Yeah.
And we tend not to and then for a lot of African Americans, a lot of people of color of different backgrounds, there's shame and embarrassment attached to, the dynamics of race too. It's not a subject that anyone has an easy time discussing.
Okay. Well, not intentionally being rhetorical here, you write in one of your books about Black Lives Matter. So
Sure.
Do people really grasp the concept of the Black Lives Matter movement? Especially if you're not black. And when it comes to race, do they only see color? The reason why I say that is I was doing a little research on you, and you had contributed to an interview sometime with the Seattle Times. And the question was asked, and I'm not sure if it was taken from your book, it says here, in the matter of black lives, you imply that some people consider race a biological trait rather than a social artifact. A Northwestern University study found that 37% of white people and 25% of black people believe biology determines race. Okay, and however, the Human Genome Project found that all humans are 99.9% genetically identical, and should thinking of race as a societal label instead of a biological fact be a significant discussion today. I found that a really interesting approach with that percentage and that statistic alone in itself.
So one of the fascinating things is that humans are basically indistinguishable on the genetic level. The things that we call race don't relate to any actual categorizations. So race doesn't exist biologically, but it does exist socially. There are a group of people who, based upon their general physical traits, have been categorized as African American or black.
Right.
There are people who, based upon a general collection of traits, are thought of as white. People who, despite the tremendous diversity, would be thought of as Asian, and so on. And so these categories don't really mean anything in a scientific sense. As a matter of fact, there's significantly more distinction between men and women than there is between any kind of racial category.
How about that?
Yeah, and so it's important for that to be the starting place.
Sure.
The reason that race is so confusing is the fact that it's made up, it's a lie.
Yeah.
And we're trying to articulate, we've been living our lives grappling with something that's completely untrue. Of course it's confusing.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be confusing, right?
Well, and I look at this today, and for some of the students that might be in like political science and all of these, everything is judged by titles and putting titles to things which not necessarily has to be the case. And I'm one that, just kind of disregards titles, in certain instances. So with that being said, what role does education play in solving this racial war, in your opinion, do you think? Particularly with our younger generations now, who may say that they don't see it, or they don't see it as much as it used to be if you haven't experienced it or know the history of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that education is key. It's really the only solution here. We need to have candid, frank, honest conversations about how we got into the particular inequalities of this society.
Okay.
But we've never been bound to replicate the mistakes of the past. There's always the possibility of moving in a different direction.
Okay.
And I think that education is at the center of that.
Okay, great. So let's shift to politics. And I've seen you on some of the national networks and cable news, and your perspectives I agree with. All of them, they're right on, they're spot on. So let's say this. Is our three-branch political system in total disarray these days, in your opinion? And if so, what is the most alarming issue that sticks out with you?
Well, yeah, we have particular difficulties in each of the branches of government. I think probably the most striking thing of late is the disregard that people have for the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is typically above the fray.
Sure.
And people typically hold a particular respect for them. That's not really the case now.
Yeah.
You know, at least you're starting to see levels of criticism around the court that you did not typically see, you know, in recent history. So that's part of it. I also think that we have, across the board, declining trust and faith in government,
Right.
which is in some ways a barometer of how we feel about each other.
Yeah.
You know, since government is supposed to be made up of the people. And so the conflict is not so much about government as it is about how we interact with each other.
Would you say, if we use the term, is our democracy under assault, is the judicial become politicized?
Sure.
Yeah. And,
Sure.
and just as some of the examples we see now, which one sticks out to you the most recently?
Well, there are a few.
Okay.
You know, I think that Justice Alito, who got into a kind of back and forth argument with a journalist at The Atlantic named Adam Serwer, I guess that was, you know, within the last year or so,
Right.
which you would never typically see, you know,
Sure.
before that. Obviously, Justice Thomas's wife having some connection
Right.
to the events of January 6th, and we don't know exactly the extent of it. The fact that she's been called to testify, that is tremendously troubling.
Sure.
I think that the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade also was very damaging to the reputation of the court.
Sure.
Because irrespective of how you feel about abortion,
Right.
the conservative majority got onto the court by essentially not coming out and saying, but sidestepping the question of abortion, or pretty much making it seem that they had no intention of overturning Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. That's
and so-
amazing in itself.
Right. And so if that happens, there's a portion of the public that's going to feel like they've been lied to. And I think that's part of what we're seeing, the backlash to.
Yeah, and you know, it's happening in real time as we see it unfold in front of our faces these days. Now, the Congressional Black Caucus, have they been vocal enough on the subjects of race and politics and the Constitution and democracy, and can they do more? Are their hands tied, or should they become more vocal, or are they just basically trying to sit in the comforts of, you know, those that they represent and all? How do you feel, or what are your feelings on that?
I think the Congressional Black Caucus is a mixed bag. You know, there's some that you know, some things they do that are great, some things that are not so much. But generally speaking, I think that the caucus really had an opportunity to push this administration, you know, on certain issues that haven't happened. You know, there's been no movement on police reform.
Sure.
There's been no movement on voting rights reform, and I won't put the weight of all that on the Congressional Black Caucus on their shoulders. But you certainly wish that they had been more effective in trying to get something done on
Yeah,
these issues.
you would think that would be some of their primary agenda opportunities there, to really speak on it as a collective body.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, now let's shift into history, which I know you are a historian. I would say, is history repeating itself?
No, I mean, I don't think the history really repeats itself.
Similarities, perhaps?
Yeah, I think there are similarities, you know, and so, because human nature is so similar over time. You know, we think that the circumstances have changed, but the same motivations, apply to our actions across, the great sprawl of time. And so it's not entirely shocking that you see similar situations, evolve. As a species, we're still basically the same as we were 500 years ago. And so we tend to do the same stuff that we were doing 500 years ago. And so history is the record of it, is this our ability to pick up those similarities.
Okay.
But we're also not doomed to make the same mistakes that we've made before.
Well, for our viewing audience and our students here, if I were to ask you what part of history would you encourage the students and the viewers to pay close attention to as we talk about repeating itself or the similarities, what era or what part of history strikes you the most, where you have the most interest?
Well, I always think that Americans generally need to know more about the Civil War. Mm-hmm. The Civil War has never ceased to be relevant. It has been relevant when it happened and ever since. Mm-hmm. I also think that it's important to get a real understanding of the history of American immigration. Because the conflicts that we have in our society now, especially around immigration, tend to echo conflicts that arose in earlier time periods. And so that's important. And lastly, I would say, just thinking about what's happening, in Ukraine now, mm-hmm. and the kind of global conflict that's emerging, it's useful to revisit the history of the Cold War.
Yeah, and you mentioned the Ukraine and places in that region, because I know Finland has accepted 2 million immigrants, and in the United States, being the best country, as we like to say, are having this problem with immigration and being founded on immigration. It's kind of, it's perplexing. I mean, I don't get it sometimes. And what would you say to that in itself? Looking at that plaque at Ellis Island, sure. and all of that, is it hypocritical, or what?
Well, not necessarily. Mm-hmm. Because we weren't really founded on immigration in the way that we say we were.
Right.
And what I mean by that is that, the 1790 immigration law in the United States said that immigration was only open to, quote, free white people. Yeah. And so from the outset, there have been complexities and bigotries that have been connected to the history of American immigration.
Sure.
At the same time, there are other moments in which people have been tremendously welcoming. Or elements of American society that have been tremendously welcoming. So we have this very complicated history with immigration, which is why I think studying the history of immigration in this country is so important.
Sure.
Because it'll give us a sense of how we have the kind of currents and kind of battles we have now.
And as a person of color, it makes you feel a certain kind of way when you see, when Serbia had the conflict and some of the other places like the Ukraine, the doors were opening and inviting, whereas the poor folks from Haiti that suffered from a hurricane and Puerto Rico were seeking sanctuary and all, and to turn around and be sent back, that it just kind of makes your jaw drop. It's like, wow,
Sure. Yeah.
So,
I think it's really interesting that we talked about, for Governor Ron DeSantis, I wrote about this in the New Yorker, when he flew 50 Venezuelans, to Martha's Vineyard and just kind of dropped them there. But the obvious contradiction is that Florida's policy toward Cuban immigrants,
yes,
for those very many years, and all the contradictions there. So, yeah.
All right. You see these things, and as I said, we have a new generation here that has the opportunity to change, and get involved and make America that promise it's supposed to be. So what are your thoughts on CRT and the whole discussion there, teaching it in schools in Black versus Black history? And it seems to be some confusion for some.
There's a lot of confusion.
Yeah.
Like, for one, I have yet to see a school where CRT was being taught outside of law schools,
Sure.
maybe universities.
Yeah.
99% of what's referred to as critical race theory is not at all critical race theory.
Right.
Critical race theory is not the same as Black history.
Sure.
It's not the same as anti-racism training. It's not any of those things.
Sure.
I keep saying it is a very specific body of legal literature that you are only likely going to encounter if you are in your second or third year of law school.
Sure. And I'm glad you kind of clarified that, because in many cases when you ask someone that is actually speaking out against it, they can't really tell you what it is and all.
The best thing to do when someone kind of goes on about critical race theory is to ask them which theorist they're referring to.
Yeah.
Because I mean, literally, they're a group of theorists. Say, whose work are you referring to, and what book or what article have you read that you're criticizing?
Yeah. And speaking of books, now we're at the process of banning books, and you being a dean of journalism, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, and knowledge and information only enhances your thoughts and knowledge. So what are your feelings on the banning of information and censoring and things of that nature?
Yeah, obviously I'm very unsettled by that. Now I do think that there is material that we should constrain, material like misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms. Very different conversation. But for books, many of which are kind of classic parts of American scholarship or American literature, I really don't think that we get any closer to democracy by banning subjects like that.
Yeah, and when you look at books like To Kill a Mockingbird or some of the Huckleberry Finn stuff, it's just that. So those are the books that I, read coming up and in school, and if we start there, what's next?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So a couple of more. I think we've got time to get a couple of more issues in. Let's go to education, which is why we're here once again. What role will education play in the scenario to resolve issues that we're facing us today? I know that's a broad question, but in your opinion, education and the value of it, and what and where and how should we use it today?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things,
which you're particularly involved in as a dean. Okay.
One of the things I think, as a historian, is that I always think that history makes the present make sense. When we look at our educational system, we tend not to ask where it came from and why we have the educational system we have. So, very short history of American education. First, you just wanted to learn the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic,
right.
To have, the ability to just operate in society. Then when we get a large immigrant population, the end of the 19th century, 1880s, 1920s or so, they want the schools to teach people how to be American, to instill American values in them. You go a little bit further in, and after World War II especially, you begin to be concerned about global competition. We want our schools to produce the next generation of engineers, teachers, doctors, people who are going to allow the United States to maintain its edge in the world. And now we look at productivity and looking at the challenges of globalism and all these things. These are the things that we think about with our educations. We also have to include going back to that fundamental thing of what your responsibilities are in a democracy. And our schools are key to all of that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. We've got a couple of minutes here. Are we still competitive on the world stage? You mentioned global, and education has always been the forefront, but we see countries like Japan, Asia, and some of the foreign lands excelling. I mean, what is it that they're doing that we're not, or what is it? You know what I'm saying there?
Yeah, it's hard to make apples to apples comparisons when you look at information like that, because sometimes we're comparing the entire set of American students to a very elite set of students in other countries. Because not all students have access to education, so hard to say, like what the actual comparison is. You have to be very specific about, particular things. But I do think that, especially on the level of higher education, The United States is intensely competitive.
Sure.
People come from all over the world to study at universities here. They come from all over the world to do research here. Our institutions of higher education, and I'm happy that I'm at one today,
Sure.
our institutions of higher education are literally the envy of the world.
Okay.
And so it's not something that we should ever take for granted, but it is something that we should invest in more than we do right now.
Awesome, fantastic, well said. With about 30 seconds, as the dean, new dean of the School of Journalism for Columbia University, which I'm sure students come from all around the world
Yeah,
to
we do.
that.
Yeah, they do.
What keeps you motivated and inspired?
The world.
Okay.
Every morning I wake up and I see something that needs to change.
Okay.
And I know that in my work, I can add a little contribution toward making the world better.
Fantastic.
And so that's all the motivation I need.
Fantastic. I often see as a person in broadcasting and journalism school as well, we didn't see many faces like mine or yours in the fields. And we often say, he who controls the narrative controls the story. How do you feel about more people of color getting into journalism and providing that perspective? And how important is that to you with what you're doing as a dean as well?
I think that's tremendously important. It's one of the most important things in my job. I think the field should reflect the communities.
Sure.
And we have a tremendous amount of diversity in this country. That should be reflected in our newsrooms. It should be reflected in the makeup of our editors, groups and boards. It should be reflected throughout the entirety of this profession, largely because we want the perspectives. We want all of the stories. We want all of the stakeholders to participate in all of the storytelling. And I think that only makes journalism better.
Awesome, fantastic. Dr. Dean Jelani Cobb, thank you, sir, for joining Soul Issue, the African American Perspective today. I enjoyed the conversation, inspiring, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Well, that's it for this show. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, remember to teach your children to respect one another, and let's all hold ourselves to a higher standard. If it matters to you, it matters to us. And if it matters, it's a Soul Issue. I'm Daryl Newton for Soul Issue, the African American Perspective.